All right, welcome back to part 3. In the last video, we left off with rendering everything from Maya. So now we need to go back into After Effects and then start compositing. I've already loaded in the 5 sequences into After Effects. So we have 2 sequences for shot A, 3 for shot B. Now on this, we need to go to the top one up here, go to Interpret Footage, Main, make sure you interpret this at 24 FPS, go into Color Management and make sure you interpret as linear and force that to be on. So just remember that After Effects does not do this automatically for EXR sequences that are below 32 bits per channel. And the ones we're using are only 16. So click OK. Then we can select back on that same one, interpret footage again, and remember interpretation. Shift select the other ones, and then select apply interpretation. I'm going to take shot B, put that into the shot B folder, and then take the shot A sequences and put them into shot A. So now we can grab shot A, pull these above the base. You can turn off this base texture here. Zoom in here. By the way, the shortcut key for that is the question mark key, or just shift slash. Kind of fits up to 100%. And now let's get started. So we're going to take AO, put AO above. For now, we're just going to turn that off. So the first thing we have to do is line up the track. So we go to the plate, go to our Mocha effect, create track data, and then go to the Petri 3D object track, then click OK. On the layer export, we're going to go to shot A and then apply export. So now it's going to be moving around with it. It's just not going to be exactly where we want it to be. So now we need to go to shot A, and we're going to grab either another corner pin or you can use a power pin. So I prefer power pin, and especially since we already have a corner pin, it's kind of easier to work with if there's a different effect. I'm going to pull this above the regular corner pin and then simply reposition this so it fits where we want it to go on the dish. So we're going to do something like that. And then let's just play this forward and see how it looks. So there's a little bit of a slide at the beginning there, but for the rest of this looks pretty good. I'm not really seeing anything super noticeable. There is one thing though where we didn't have motion blur on, so I want to show you the difference and why it's important to use a supports motion blur option with your corner pins. Turn on motion blur, make sure it's on for the composition, and then re-render it, and then you can see what it looks like with the motion blur on. So as this is rendering, I just wanted to point out one thing here. Anytime that you have a corner pin track, if you want to have any type of transform adjustment, or you're loading in layers or something like with an extractor, you always need to put that before the track kicks in. If you put them afterwards, it's going to kind of mess up the placement a little bit. So if I put this corner pin underneath here, it would not track properly. So that looks pretty good here. And then you'll notice at the end with motion blur on, you'll get the blur going, which is what we need. We need that to match. Same thing from the top here. We want that to match as well. So that looks pretty good. So the next part here is to separate this sequence to all the different passes and then actually start compositing the different pieces together. I'm just going to call this growth. And this specific layer is just the beauty. So it's all the passes combined. To extract them, we're going to use extractor. And the beauty does not need extractor, so we're just going to duplicate that and then drag an extractor on the duplicate here. And just so you don't forget to do this, we're going to turn off the beauty pass right now. And then you won't ever forget to turn it off. I've seen that a lot of times with students that they have composited everything and then their beauty is either at the top or at the bottom, and if it's at the top it just completely covers everything that you're trying to composite, so just make sure that's off. It's for reference purposes only. Okay, so going back to extractor here, extractor needs to be above all of these corner pins. You can see here that it's black, and that's because these corner pins are adjusting the positions. I'm going to pull this above. Now the color is reset. This is what it's supposed to be. If you've used extractor in the past, you'll notice that this UI is a bit different, and honestly it's a lot better. It's easier to use. So instead of having that silly button to click, now you just get directly to your layers, and we can just select GI. You also probably want to unmultiply this. It's not going to make a big difference for anything except for the Z depth on this particular one, but just a good idea to generally you want to unmultiply it if you've rendered with a black background. All right, so next we're going to call this GI. Duplicate that. Next layer is going to be lighting. Duplicate that. Then we're going to do specular and then reflection. Now the order of these layers does not matter because they're all going to be additive, so make sure you change your blending mode there. GI is normal, and AO at the top here, AO is multiplied. But I just realized I forgot to put the tracking information down, so we go back to the plates, change the export layer to shot A, AO, apply. I'm going to grab that power pin, paste in the power pin, then pull it above the regular corner pin. Turn this layer on, change the blending mode to multiply, and now we're just getting the shadows. So if we got to do AO, without AO, your paint effects will never look grounded. They'll always look like they're floating above whatever the texture is. So in this case, with the little shadows, it makes it look a lot better, right? You definitely need AO. So now I'm just going to rename this one to be Growth AO. So now we have all of the main passes composited, but now we need to grab Z-depth. Z-depth is going to be a little bit different, so we can just duplicate reflection. I'm going to pull this above here though, call this one Z-depth. Now Z-depth does not have a blending mode. It's just going to be normal. And then on the layers here, we're just going to select Z for Z-depth. In this version of Extractor for single channeled passes, such as Z-depth, you don't have to go and manually reselect them all to Z's. It does it for you, which is nice. I like to keep utility passes above all the rest of the passes. So this is why this is on top. Next, we're going to pre-compose it, and we're going to leave all attributes. We want all of these to be just left alone, then click OK. So when you do that, you gotta grab Extractor because there's nothing to extract on top of the comp. Go inside the comp and then paste the Extractor back in. So now this is correct. I'm gonna lock this comp position here, double click our Z-depth comp, drag that over to the side, and then we're going to work on this one. If you watched the plane compositing tutorial I did a few months ago, this is going to be more or less the same, but one thing that's going to be different here is we really want to have that base of the Petri dish in here, and I forgot to actually put this on a separate render layer. So instead of having to go back into Maya and re-render it, what we're going to do is just use a matte from the AO. So all we have to do is take this AO layer, drag this underneath, and we'll just call this just base, and we're going to grab a gradient effect. So we want a gradient ramp, pull this over. And the way this is going to work, pull this over to the side a little bit. We select this layer, and then we can pull these positions down. So they're about around here. And then we're going to sample the end color, can be like that. And then the start color can be like that. So we want to have something that's kind of like this. So it looks like it was rendered in Maya with that same type of gradient. So a lot of these are going to be invisible, but that's okay. Now, this is just so when we reference this layer in the Z-depth, in the camera lens blur, if you didn't have this border and it was off, the camera blur would stop with a hard edge wherever this is, which isn't very realistic. So we definitely want to have a cleaner approach to this. Now, there are plugins for this, such as this one, the Frischluft. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but these two effects are awesome. They're pretty expensive for what it does, but it does it really, really well. So if I'm doing anything professionally or just my own projects, I always use this. It just does a lot better job, and you can use Z-depth passes directly without having to do silly things like this. All right, so let's go back into our main composition. We're going to turn this layer off, and we actually have to approach defocus in a slightly different way to that plane tutorial. Because the plate in the plane tutorial was CG and we did want it to be out of focus, we could just have an adjustment layer that would affect everything, including the plane and the background. But in this case, we only want to blur the growth effect and nothing on the plate. So what we have to do in this case is create a new null object. We'll just call this defocus control. And for this, we'll grab a camera lens blur effect. So camera lens blur, drag this over here. We're going to rename this to be master camera lens blur. Just go to the first pass. It doesn't really matter which one you do it on, and then grab another camera lens blur. So on here, I'm just going to click E and then open up camera lens blur, and then do the same here. E, open up camera lens blur. So on all of these passes, we're going to have a camera lens blur effect that references this defocus control effect. So we're going to go down to blur radius, hold down the Alt key, and then select the stopwatch, drag the pick whip, and put that over blur radius. And now if we change the blur radius here in the master control, you can see it's changed down here on the child. There's a couple other things that we want to do here as well on the blur map. We definitely need to change this here to be growth Z-depth. That's going to be the comp. We can do effects and masks, and we actually have to do the same thing on the master. You can't animate this parameter, and you also can't use expressions on it either. We'll do the same thing there. Same thing with repeat edge pixels. We want that to be on. We always want that to be on. We would never really want to animate that on and off. So just make sure that is selected on both. So the only other thing that we might want to change here is going to be the blur focal distance. So let's open up that in the blur map of the master camera lens blur. Then scroll down to the child, make sure that's open, hold down the Alt key on blur focal distance, drag the pick whip up, and then we're going to attach that to the blur focal distance of the master camera lens blur control. So this is going to allow us to change the focus after the fact. All right, so let's close these layers, grab the child effect for the camera lens blur, and then paste it on each one of these passes. This beauty pass up here, we can just pull this. We can just pull this above everything else here. This is just for reference purposes, so you can turn it on, turn it off to see what was rendered from Maya versus what you composited. So anytime you want to change your defocus, you just do it here on your defocus control. I'm also going to turn this layer off so you don't see that annoying box in the way. And then we can just take a look here. So as the further back we go, the more blurry it gets, but in the center, it's more in focus. So to pull this back into the center, To really see this working, let's increase our blur radius to something like 20. So they're really, really blurry. Then we just increase our focal distance. And you can now see that these are the ones that are in focus, which is about where the focus is. Okay. Really, we don't want the blur to be that crazy. And in fact, even 5 is too much. We'll do something more like, I think 1 was pretty good. We could maybe do 2. I think 2 looks pretty good. We can go ahead and tweak that a little bit later. So now let's go ahead and add a texture to our Petri dish base layer. So for this, again, we're going to make sure this is locked. Double click our Petri dish base, drag this over, fit both of these up to 100%. I'll actually move this over a little bit so we get a little bit of a better view. Go back to our main comp, make sure this is actually turned on. You should see that black border. And for this, I need to load in some textures. So I'm going to go ahead and just make a new folder here called textures. Open this up. So I'm going to pull in some of the textures here that I used for the Maya part of this, or I gathered for the Maya part. I'm going to go ahead and start with this pomegranate texture. And for this, I'm going to delete the solid that's in there. We don't really want that in there anymore. Scale this up so it covers the entire thing. And then we're going to grab one of these mats. So these mats that I'm using here, this grunge mat and this moisture mat, these are actually from Substance Designer, and they're just default grunge bitmaps that they have provided, and they're 8K, so they're huge. So if you don't have Substance Designer, it's a great piece of software, and it has some really useful things that just right out of the box that you can just save out and then use them for other things as well, such as this, which is pretty cool. Now for this, I'm not going to make a mat for this as well. I'm going to try to keep my layers pretty simple, but I'm going to just roughly go around the perimeter here, adding some points just to kind of roughen this up, get something like that. I add a couple more points here, just make this a little bit more jagged. Then we'll add a roughen edges. And for roughen edges, we're going to take the border quite high up, take the sharpness down, crank that border up to the maximum, and then we can just feather the regular mask with the F key. So at this point, the pomegranate can be switched to a Luma mat. And then we have more of a broken up pattern here. Now, if you wanted to switch this to a Luma inverted, because we were actually using that Luma with the alpha, we want to undo that. If you wanted to do something that was opposite of this, you can simply use an invert effect. I'll flip these values around. In this case, though, it was already pretty good. So I'm going to keep this just normal. Another thing that you can do, even if you have this mask in place already, you can grab the pan behind tool or the Y key. Then you can just reposition this, find a better position, and the mask stays in the same place. But I'm quite happy with this. I am going to grab a curves though, just to adjust the contrast. Pull this over. Do something kind of like that. I think that looks all right. We will later on, we'll blur this, but you do want to make sure it doesn't go over the edges. So we'll pull this in a little bit from the sides. Same thing down here. We don't want it to go quite so far. All right, so now I'm just going to play around with some other textures. I'll grab this slime one. Scale this down, and I'll use an effect called Reptile. Expand this left and right. We'll do something like 1500 pixels, and we'll add that to the left, down, and up parameters. Then we can change the tiling in a little bit if that's going to be an issue. Then we could use this other grunge map here. Actually, I think I'll do this one. And then on the slime, we'll just change that to be Luma. And I think on this, I'm going to scale down the grunge map. And on this, I'm going to invert it. So I'll grab an invert effect. And then I'll grab another pen tool and then just roughly go over the areas where you want this to go, over that orange part. Let some of that green kind of creep around here as well. And then I'm going to take the same roughen edges from that moisture layer, paste this on here, and then we'll just have something else to work with. This makes it a little bit more natural, not as sharp. But again, we can come and change these. All right, so I loaded in a couple more textures. Try this meat one. Not sure if this is really going to be what I want. I don't think I want a lot of those like sinew parts here, like the fat. I just really want some of those little textures in there. I can just reposition that there. I'm just going to rotate this around more like that. Grab another Reptile effect and just drag this one. It would actually be the down because we rotated that one. So that's going to create a seam, so we can just blend the edges. I think this should be okay. Next, we can grab another type of mat. I do have one here. Grab Grunge Map 14, slap this on here. Looks kind of interesting. Use Luma for this as well. Definitely want to grab a curve though on the grunge map and then just boost that up a little bit. This would get some kind of red areas around here. In fact, we could lower that a little bit too. Looks kind of interesting. Then of course, same thing as before, grab another pen tool, drag this around here. I want each one to be a little bit different. This is why I'm not just copying and pasting it. I want the option to be able to control it differently. And I also don't want to have to mess with pre-composing matte layers on this. Grab that same roughen edges effect, copy, paste that down there. All right, so now we're getting something that looks pretty disgusting. I think perhaps on the slime material, if we turn this one off, I think it's covering up a little bit too much of the holes. So we'll go back to that grunge map. And I think on this one, what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab a curves on this one, and I definitely want it to be a bit darker. We're going to crush down some of those areas that are a bit brighter. So the darker it gets, I mean, less of that slime is going to show through. So more like that, basically. It's also on the slime, there's that hard edge. We are going to repeat the pixels there as well, and that should fade those edges out a bit better. I think on the direction of this pomegranate, I want to rotate this round. I want these edges to go the other way. And in doing that, we're probably going to have to stretch that out a bit. I think that looks a little bit better. We were getting a lot of lines that are going more or less the same direction. And then here on this meat texture, I don't think I want this part here. So I can just take this mask in, pull that there, pull these in a little bit too. I don't want them to go so close to the edge. You can also feather this out a little bit more. Okay, so it looks kind of interesting. We've got a lot of stuff going on. The colors though, they're not really matching, but it's useful to leave colors on there as you're messing around with placement. So it's very easy to tell where things are. At least that's what I like to do. But next we're going to select all these layers, just collapse them. And then we're going to start with this slime layer, and I'm going to change the color and the saturation. So we're going to first lower the saturation down a little bit, and then we're going to change this so it's not quite red, but it's definitely kind of a gross green color, more like that. And then we can go to the pomegranate. I think that's a bit saturated, so we can lower the saturation of that down quite a bit, around -30. I kind of like the meat actually. The meat layer kind of ties in together these little bits, but we can come back. We can play around with this later. Another thing is on this meat texture, there's a little bit too much detail, but when we add the blur layer to it, it should make that go away. Otherwise, we can go ahead and then just manually blur this layer ourselves. I'm gonna go ahead and shut that down now, go back to our main composition, and then we're gonna just do a little bit more color correction. And I just realized that we actually haven't done any color correction for the plate, so let's do that first. Go ahead and create a new adjustment layer. Just call this CC, drag this up here, grab our curves. And for this, we'll add just a bit more brightness and take the blue channel up. And we definitely want to take the red channel down. We want to do something more this. Definitely is going to darken that down a little bit. And then on the texture here, I think we might need to go and add just a bit more gaps. It's looking a little too homogeneous now after all of that. So on this pomegranate one, on the moisture texture matte, pull this in. And what we could do right here, because it looks a little strong here, grab another little mask there, click M, switch this one to be subtractive, go to the feathering, and then just bump up the feathering to about 100. I think that looks a little bit better. You could do the same thing here as well, just for this edge, and we could do one here as well. So both of these could be subtractive. On this slime, we could do the same thing. We could feather the grunge map out a little bit as well. We'll do something like 300 pixels. All right, so let's go back to the main shot now. We could play around with this forever, like I always say with things like this. For the Petri dish base though, we should go ahead and then switch this to overlay. I'm just gonna darken this down quite a bit. So because it gets darker, we do wanna go into our curves and probably just bump up the black values up, just like that. But now this is gonna look more moldy. So if you don't like overlay because it's kind of got rid of a lot of that texture, you could experiment with some other ones, but this one really doesn't blend particularly well with the Petri dish because we definitely want to include some of that texture. This is why overlay would be a good one to choose because it's also going to change with the light. Multiply is going to be very, very dark. I mean, you could use multiply, but I think in this case we do get the lighter areas. I'm going to go back to one of these passes, grab the camera lens blur that we just made, then we're going to paste that on here as well. So by pasting on the camera lens blur from the passes, since it uses that base from the AO, it's going to cover up this area as well, and it's going to blur the areas a bit better. Now we can add another camera lens blur to kind of blur that just a little bit more, but I think this is looking pretty okay. Next, let's start compositing some of these pieces up here. Grab a curves above the camera lens blur. I'm going to pull the GI up a little bit. You don't want it to do it too much. It's very sensitive. So you're trying to lift this up so the black values blend in better with the Petri dish. So this now looks like they were all on the same scene, more or less. If you turn this off, they're very, very dark. If it stand out too much, this looks a little bit better. For the specularity, we can see that these are the highlights. If we turn these off, they look very dry. With them on, they look a little shiny. I'm going to grab the red channel here, pull this up a little bit. So if you do it a lot, they're like really, really red. You just want to do it more like that. They are a little bit too sharp, so I'm going to grab a fast box blur before the camera lens blur. Zoom in here. We want to just do this very slightly, like not even really 1 pixel, maybe half a pixel, 0.25. They're just too sharp, so we want to just soften those out. That looks a little bit more natural. Next, for the reflection, I don't really have any qualms with the reflection right now. If you wanted to make that a little bit more reflective though, grab a curves, and then you can add a bit more light to the scene. So we could do something like that. And normally this type of situation would indicate that you're clipping the values, but these are so dark as it is anyway. We have quite a lot of room to play with, so we can just crush these values up until we get around there. And now these are going to be quite a bit brighter, and they're going to interact more with the light as it goes back and forth. Quite like that. I think this should be pretty interesting to continue and to see how we get the other shot to look. All right, so let's go ahead and save this. And in the next part, we can move on to the final scene.